Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the wonderful new facility at the Chicago Council. It's great to be here. It's great to be here this afternoon. On behalf of the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, I'm honored to welcome the Right Honourable Carwyn Jones, the First Minister of Wales. With the Brexit vote followed soon by the change of Prime Minister, the UK has had a tumultuous summer, something we're a little familiar with right now. The dust is still settling, but British and European politics remain in a period of uncertainty. Complex negotiations lay ahead as the UK and EU redefine their relationship in critical policy areas including trade, market access, agriculture, freedom of movement, and immigration. Meanwhile, sharp differences in voting patterns between England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales have called into question the relationship between Westminster and the devolved assemblies in Cardiff, Edinburgh, and Stormont. In Wales, where voters narrowly voted to leave the EU, the Welsh government is preparing for a future of uncertainty by emphasizing its strengths and global connections. This summer was a great showcase for the Welsh spirit and endeavor as the nation's soccer team shone at the Euro 2016 tournament in France. They stole attention away from Wales' illustrious rugby team, which is quite an accomplishment. In recent years have been good for the Welsh economy, particularly in terms of attracting inward investment. Wales' global connectivity, educated workforce, infrastructure, and natural beauty have attracted record numbers of companies in the past 2 years, many from the US. The challenge for the Welsh government today is to maintain momentum through uncertain months and years ahead. And I look forward to hearing the First Minister's views on the implication of the Brexit vote and the outlook for Wales. But first, by way of background, our guest today has been the First Minister of Wales since 2009, is the Welsh National Assembly member for the constituency of Bridgend, and previously held a number of ministerial roles in the Welsh government, covering rural affairs, the environment, and open government. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Right Honourable Carwyn Jones, First Minister of Wales.
Well, thank you very much, Greg, and prynhawn da I chi gyd. Good afternoon to you all. That's an example of my home language, the language I spoke at home, Welsh, which has its roots in the Celtic languages and is a cousin language of Irish. My wife is Irish, so I've done my best to promote inter-Celtic relations over the past 22 years. But thank you, first of all, for the invitation to speak here today. I understand this is the first lunch session to be held at this wonderful new facility here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs' new headquarters. So this is a very special occasion for me. I know that bringing together leaders from business, from government, from education, from the arts to drive policy analysis and find solutions on global issues is no easy task in any country in the world. So it's truly remarkable that here in the US, the CCGA is rated as the #1 think tank to watch by the 2015 Global Go-To Think Tank Index. Now, it's particularly enjoyable to be here in Chicago. This is an unbelievably diverse city, and people from all over the world have made their mark and made their contribution to the history of this city, and the Welsh have also made a mark on this city, mainly for the better, but not always. I'll come to that in a minute. Now, Chicago's founder can trace his roots back to Wales. Thomas Jefferson Vance Owen became the first president of the town of Chicago in 1833. And Chicago is perhaps the most architecturally outstanding city in America. I can say that here, whether I say it in other cities is a different matter. But it was a Welsh American, Frank Lloyd Wright, who designed some of the most loved buildings in the Chicago area. He came from a Welsh farming community in Wisconsin known as the God Almighty Joneses. And he never forgot his Welsh roots and his personal motto. In Welsh, y gwir yn erbyn y byd, which means the truth against the world. It's a bardic motto still in use in Wales today. However, on the debit side, you may have heard of Murray Llewellyn Humphreys, popularly known as Murray the Hump. or the camel, because of his fondness for camel hair coats. He was the financial brains behind the Chicago outfit in the first half of the 20th century, working closely with Al Capone, and was at one time the most powerful mafioso in America. Well, his parents were from Carno, a small village near Newtown in mid-Wales. The village does not make a lot of noise about the link, but nevertheless, it is there. What then, though, of more contemporary and positive issues and examples? Chicago is, of course, the city that President Obama calls home. And one of the highlights of my time as First Minister was welcoming the President to Wales when he attended the NATO summit in 2014. That was the first time that a sitting President had visited Wales, and I'm sure it won't be the last. It's notable that Hillary Clinton, who grew up just 15 miles from here in Park Ridge, also claims Welsh heritage. Now, many of us in the UK, of course, follow American politics closely. Only Americans get to vote in American elections, but the outcome of those elections has a powerful impact on all of us in Europe. The roller coaster of an American presidential campaign can't be beaten for sheer political theatre. We marvel at the amount of money that's thrown at it. When I stood for election in May in my constituency, I was only allowed to spend the equivalent of $20,000. And it's 60,000 people that I represent. If you overspend, you can actually go to prison. So the amount of money involved in American politics is an eye-opener for us. It's true to say that in comparison, British politics sometimes lacks a certain flamboyance. I have to say, of course, that this year your presidential campaign is certainly bringing political drama to the stage, but in recent months, and usually, the UK has been giving American politics a run for its money. The vote last June, by 52% to 48%, to leave the European Union has upended British politics. That result led to the immediate resignation of Prime Minister David Cameron and his replacement by Theresa May. It's also caused considerable turmoil in my party, Labour, and it's transformed the shape of the UK's political debate for years to come. So today I'd like to look ahead and talk about some of those issues and set up my priorities for Wales, for the UK, and indeed our relationship with the EU and the wider world. Now, the first thing I should do is set out where I'm coming from. As the First Minister of Wales, my responsibility is to protect the interests of the Welsh people. I won my own political mandate at the election 4 months ago, and there's no doubt, however, that the European referendum knocked us off our stride. But we still have big ambitions for Wales, and as a government, we are determined to deliver on them. We want a dynamic business environment whilst also delivering strong public services funded through fair taxation. The two go together. We can only pay for those services if we have a prosperous economy. We're inclusive. We're an outward-facing nation. And I believe that Wales is at its best when it trades and cooperates with the rest of the world. I also believe that Wales should have a strong government with broad lawmaking and tax-raising powers, but I don't want to see independence from the rest of the UK. On the contrary, I believe that Wales's interests are well served by our membership of the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom is better and stronger for having Wales in it. And that's the view shared by a majority of the Welsh people. I also believe that the interests of Wales and the UK were best served by remaining in the European Union, but the people took a different view, and we as politicians have to accept that. But one thing I'm absolutely clear about, and it's this: Wales is and will remain open for business. The fundamentals of our economy are sound. Our unemployment rate is a little over 4%. It's lower than England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. We've just had the best figures for foreign direct investment for 30 years. Our youth unemployment rate is also much lower than the UK average. And nobody should be in any doubt about the Welsh Government's commitment to continuing Wales's outstanding record as a strong trading partner and as a compelling location for inward investment. But for that to happen, we need to remain outward focused, open to good ideas, engaged with the rest of the world. And here in Chicago, I've been struck by the tremendous economic vibrancy of the city and the way that it acts as a powerhouse for a wider region. In Wales, we're aiming for a similar effect, using Cardiff, our capital cities, and the other cities as the generators of growth, and then sharing those benefits across the wider region. But a challenge for us all is how we can transition towards high-skill, highly paid jobs while strengthening our communities. The dissatisfaction that we see in those areas that have struggled economically is a profound problem. There's no doubt in my mind that this dissatisfaction and disaffection was a partial cause of the Brexit vote. And my concern is that Brexit, if it's handled badly, will do nothing to address the challenges faced by those communities. In fact, it might well make them worse. Let's look then at the UK-EU relationship in the future. The referendum has raised some profound questions. The vote itself was simply to determine whether the UK should remain in the EU or leave. It said nothing about the terms on which we should leave. Shall we have a divorce or not? And if we do have a divorce, what next? That's where we are at the moment. It's clear to me that people voted for a number of different reasons, but the reality is, of course, that we have the outcome that we have. For some, the vote to leave was driven by concerns about sovereignty, a sense that the EU is a distant body without strong links of accountability back to the people, a sentiment that might well be recognised in other countries as well. For others, immigration was the main concern. In recent years, the UK has seen a large increase in immigration flows, particularly from Eastern Europe. Whilst I believe that the overall impact in economic terms has been positive, there's been concern, great concern, undeniably, about the impact on public services already under pressure. And they are legitimate concerns. But at the same time, we're proud to be an open, inclusive country, and our diversity is a source of strength, not weakness. And as I suggested a moment ago, some people simply wanted to register a protest in response to the sense that their communities aren't benefiting from globalization. In many cases, people arguably voted against their own direct economic interests, particularly in areas that were in receipt of financial support from the EU. But nevertheless, those areas voted to leave. In contrast, it was the most affluent areas that tended to deliver the largest Remain votes. On top of that, it was the areas with the fewest numbers of immigrants that voted more strongly to leave. That was the contradiction that we saw in the vote. So the challenge for the coming months and years will be to pull together those disparate, sometimes contradictory motivations into a coherent package on which the UK can leave the EU without inflicting needless damage to our economy. And a key question is likely to come down to this: whether or not the UK has access to the single market. At its core, the EU is a bloc of 28 countries that have created a single market of 500 million people. Within that market, goods, services, investment, and labour can flow freely across borders. It's as easy to ship car parts from Wales to Germany, say, as it is to transport them from Illinois to Indiana. And that's hugely important for firms such as Ford, which has a major engine plant in my hometown of Bridgend, and it ships the engines that are made there to Germany in the main, where they're then assembled into cars. The single market is underpinned by rules and regulations that set the framework for a competitive, dynamic market across 28 separate nation states. They mean, for example, that a life sciences firm can develop a drug in Cardiff, get it approved in the UK, and have that approval recognised by the governments of all other EU nations without having to seek clearance from 28 separate bodies. Now, why would we want to opt out of those arrangements? So for those reasons, I believe it's absolutely vital that when we leave the EU, the UK must retain access to the single market. Without that guarantee, we do risk inflicting needless economic harm on our country and on our citizens. It's also essential that the final agreement protects the rights of the thousands of EU citizens who've chosen to make Wales their home. Their contribution to our nation is hugely appreciated, and one of the most distasteful parts of the political discourse in recent months has been the suggestion that these people may be forced to leave the UK as a result of Brexit. Similarly, of course, many Welsh people have made their homes in other parts of the EU. Their rights have to be protected as well. Now, I've said that I have to recognise the mandate provided by the referendum, but also I have a mandate and a responsibility to protect and advance the interests of Wales. I have absolutely no intention of allowing Wales's fate to be left to chance, for us to be passive observers in this most momentous of decisions. Wales and the other devolved nations must play a full and active role in the negotiations to leave the EU to ensure our interests are fully protected. If this becomes a two-way dialogue between Brussels and London, it'll fail. Cardiff, Edinburgh and Belfast must also have seats at the table. Whatever deal is finally negotiated, its acceptance should be subject to the support of the four parliaments that now legislate for the UK. Now, it's worth pausing on this fundamental point, and I'll explain its significance. The governance of the UK has changed dramatically since the end of the last century. Since the programme of devolution launched by Tony Blair in 1997, we now have four governments and legislatures covering Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and the UK Parliament, which sometimes sits as the UK Parliament and sometimes as an English Parliament. Now, this has created a unique context for the negotiations to leave the EU. David Cameron recognised this with his statement that the devolved governments must be fully involved in the preparations for withdrawal, and in fairness, his successor, Theresa May, has confirmed that approach. Now, 20 years ago, it's unlikely, to say the least, that a UK government would have taken that view. There's a long road ahead to secure a package that works for the whole of the UK, and I want to work with the UK government in order to make sure that that full engagement between the governments within the UK takes place. I can't envisage consent being given by Wales unless the UK secures access to the single market and delivers solid assurances to our citizens from other EU countries, and that view, in fairness, is shared by many in the UK government. But the Brexit vote has major implications for the UK's external relations with the rest of the world. We know that. There's also an impact on the relationship between the nations of the UK. Now, Scotland voted to remain part of the EU. So, in effect, as the Scottish government would see it, it's being taken out against its wishes. Now, as someone who believes in the Union, that troubles me. The referendum outcome has given an opportunity for the Scottish government to raise again the question of a second independence referendum, despite holding and losing a vote only 2 years ago. Now, I wanted Scotland to remain within the UK in 2014. I still believe it's in the best interest of Scotland, Wales and the wider UK for us to stick together. But I have to acknowledge too that the choice facing Scotland is a difficult one. The country voted to remain in the UK and for the UK to remain in the EU. Now, that option is no longer available. People are being asked, which union do you want to keep and which one do you want to leave? So the outcome of the referendum and its impact on Scotland was immediately apparent, but there are far-reaching implications too for Northern Ireland, where, again, a majority opted to remain in the EU. In the worst-case scenario, UK withdrawal from the EU would require the introduction of a hard border between the two parts of the island of Ireland. Now, I was there 3 weeks ago. My wife is from Belfast. No one wants the border back, but no one can work out how to avoid having it back. And that border isn't a natural border. It can't be policed. In the height of the Troubles, it couldn't be policed particularly effectively. And so that question is hugely important for both the Republic and indeed for Northern Ireland. No one wants it. No one wants to see the return of that border, but the issue remains live. For example, for the first time ever, the Republic of Ireland and the UK in the future will have different immigration policies. And that's never happened before. Now, in response to the referendum result, I hosted a special meeting of the British Irish Council in Cardiff. It was attended by the Irish Taoiseach, Enda Kenny, and other heads of government and senior ministers to discuss this and related issues. And the key point here is that the UK and Ireland's shared membership of the EU has been a key factor in the success of the peace process. This shared membership has enabled free movement within the island of Ireland, and there's been substantial EU investment in projects to support peace and reconciliation. I've seen them with my own eyes all across Northern Ireland. Around the council table, there was real concern that we can't return to the days of a hard border between north and south. There is a 4-lane highway across it now that wasn't there before. Unless you can introduce some kind of border control there, it's just not going to work. But the progress that's been made towards peace can't be put at risk. That's the important point. Now, these are very big issues, and I'm determined that Wales will play its part in finding the best possible way forward. There's a lot at stake for us, including over £650 million a year of direct EU investment in crucial economic and social programmes. Now, in the referendum campaign, the Leave campaign promised time after time that Wales will be no worse off financially if we left the EU. And now many of those campaigners are in prominent positions in the UK government. And they have an absolute duty to deliver on what they promised. But a package of specific commitments for the post-Brexit world, while vital, is not sufficient of itself. Because I believe the process of withdrawal must be accompanied by a system of reformed governance of the United Kingdom for the longer term. We can't return to the old constitutional status quo where the UK was one of the most centralised states in the developed world, but we have to embrace the new reality with fresh constitutional thinking if the British Union is to survive the new tensions created by European Union exit. Unless we take this seriously, nothing up to and including the breakup of the UK into component parts will be inconceivable. Now let me emphasise, I don't want to see that. It's the last thing I want to see. But scenarios that seemed little more than political fantasies a few years ago could become plausible if we fail to make the radical changes necessary to put the UK's constitution on a sustainable footing. There's another angle here. Sometimes people look at Scotland and think, well, will Scotland become independent? What about Wales? What about Northern Ireland? Actually, there's nothing to stop England becoming independent, because England is part of the UK. I know it's 5 times bigger than the rest of us put together, but nevertheless, there is the beginning of a movement in England that says, why are we stuck with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland? Let's go off and be independent. In logic, there's no reason why that shouldn't happen. That would have been entirely implausible 10 years ago, but you can see that starting. And that's one of the things that I want to avoid in terms of seeing that develop in the future. Now, to my mind, the way ahead for the UK is to embrace some of the constitutional thinking that you've pioneered. The US gave the world a lesson in constitutional radicalism in 1776, and we can follow your lead to an extent. In the UK, power is seen as flowing downwards from the Crown through Parliament and out to the people through elected bodies which exist at the pleasure of the UK Parliament, not the other way. In the US, of course, you have the opposite. The powers of the federal government are limited, and all those powers not expressly granted to the federal government are reserved to the states or the people. Your constitution also elegantly balances the need to give areas with greater population a greater say, alongside the need to recognize the special status of US states. So as you know, each state's delegation in the House of Representatives is determined by its population, but both Wyoming and California have 2 senators, despite their enormous disparity in population. So if the UK is to survive and prosper, something approaching this kind of model is what will be required in the future. The UK is made up of 4 distinct nations as they'd see themselves, each with a unique history, identity and culture and sports teams. And the UK's governance must reflect the fact that each part enters voluntarily into a union of equals for mutual benefit. Doesn't necessarily mean a fully federal UK. It's kind of difficult when one of the 4 is so big. And the question of England is the question that actually taxes many people in terms of the future. But it does mean embracing federal thinking, above all in relation to the mutual respect to the different spheres of government and for each other's role and powers. It probably does need a written constitution, an explicit recognition of each government's mandate, a constitutional court, which kind of exists at the moment to act as a final arbiter of disputes, and a radically reshaped UK Parliament that recognises the special status of the nations and also recognition of England. There are some items of legislation that go through the UK Parliament that only English members of Parliament can vote on because they only affect England. So in effect, you have a sub-parliament within the UK Parliament that actually works as far as England is concerned. It's not really a long-term solution. Now, I'm not going to pretend to you that this isn't radical reform, and it does represent a massive challenge for the UK's political leadership, but it's one that has to be faced, I think, in this generation. It's a challenge for all political parties, but the alternative is a piecemeal, incremental approach to devolution, lacking any semblance of coherence or any vision that makes sense to our citizens. We've kicked the ball down the road for too long now, and the results haven't been particularly pretty. And this lack of joined-up thinking very nearly led to the breakup of the UK back in 2014, as the UK government struggled to develop a coherent and positive narrative for the UK. I'd hoped that the shock of that Scottish referendum would have led to a genuine opening of minds to new thinking. There's been some progress, but again, too often it's short-term, temporary fixes that are being examined. We've traditionally taken pride in the unwritten British Constitution. I'm not sure that's going to be sufficient for us in the future. Here in the US, your written constitution provides for extensive legal and financial powers to be held at state level, and of course below state level as well. Elected representatives are there to take decisions at local level, make the choices, accept the trade-offs, and elected leaders answer for their decisions at the ballot box. The result is an economy that's surely amongst the most innovative and vibrant in the world. The US provides the clearest possible proof that economies and societies can thrive when power is close to the people. Now, of course, for a federal system to work, many important powers have to be reserved to the centre. I'm not going to argue that defence should be the responsibility of the Welsh Government. Foreign affairs, monetary policy, and many aspects of welfare, a UK framework makes complete sense for everybody in those areas. And while more extensive tax and borrowing powers need to be transferred from the UK's centre, that has to be underpinned by a compensatory needs-based system of resource allocation to ensure that the UK's social safety net doesn't fray. So we need to balance accountability with fairness. What next then for Wales? Well, in recent years, the governance of Wales within the UK has been transformed. 17 years ago, there was no Welsh government, there was no Welsh legislature, no political Wales. And we've made tremendous progress in strengthening Welsh democracy. We've secured extensive lawmaking powers, we're on the path to acquiring significant tax powers, and we're using those powers to reflect the preferences of Welsh citizens. I would say that, wouldn't I? But that's what we've tried to do. As we move towards a different UK, outside of the EU, Wales will need to up its game in terms of our international engagement. It's clear that our relations with the US in particular, in terms of the economic relationship, governmental and cultural, will only become more important. The US is our single most important trading partner. Number one for exports, number one for investment, and today we have a presence in key markets across America, including here in Chicago. And we work closely with the UK government to promote Wales as a great location for business investment, and it's vital that that collaboration should continue. And despite the current political uncertainties, as I mentioned earlier, the core case for Wales as a business location remains extremely strong. We share, in the main, a common language, English rather than Welsh, but we also have flexible labour markets, a competitive corporate tax regime, rents far below those charged in London, world-class universities, a high-skilled workforce, great quality of life, and a track record of investment success, and a government that is there to offer support, to be a facilitator rather than an obstacle. I've never been interested in attracting footloose investment by engaging in a race to the bottom on wage rates and environmental standards. That doesn't work. Someone else will come along and undercut you in the future. That was tried in the 90s in Wales, and sure enough, those low-paid jobs went somewhere else where wage rates were even lower. we know that provided the ground rules are fair, stronger flows of trade and foreign investment will benefit firms and workers on both sides of the Atlantic. Over 230 US companies have already invested in Wales. They're major global players, many from the Midwest. They've chosen Wales as an overseas location. They include names like Ford, GE Aviation, and Kellogg's. And with confidence still high in the Welsh economy, investment into Wales continues, including, for example, Zimmer Biomet, based in Indiana, who I met yesterday. And their success in Wales is good for the Welsh workforce, certainly, but ultimately, their success in Wales also helps those firms to thrive here in the US. Now, I'm ambitious for us to do more together, and I'd like to encourage all of you, whether you're in the business world, in education, the cultural sector, to take a look at what Wales has to offer. We're keen as a government to work with you. In conclusion then, at that point I always look up to make sure that people's heads are starting to rise. Oh, right, it's coming to an end already. The UK's political system is enduring a period of turmoil. There are major risks, certainly, but there are also opportunities if we're prepared to take them. One of the greatest strengths of America is the optimism of its people, the readiness to see opportunities in every challenge. Well, I'm optimistic about Wales. We can secure our place in the European single market. We can reforge our country as a more federal union of 4 different nations. And we can build ever stronger links with the US, our oldest friend and ally. Difficult and unpredictable times lie ahead for the world, but there'll come a point when that unpredictability disappears and we see more stability. It's hugely important that all politicians, whichever country they may be in, work towards the common goal, and that is to make sure that all people across the world get the security, the prosperity, and the jobs that they need. It's a big ask, but as far as Wales is concerned, we are very much, we hope, part of the solution. Thanks very much indeed for listening, and I understand now I'll be taking some questions.
Thank you very much, First Minister. That was a wonderful speech and great to know the varied Welsh morals that invaded the city of Chicago. We'll go out to you now for questions. If you could raise your arm and we'll call on you. I'll start off with Adele Simmons, our board member, please. The mic is right there. My colleagues have mics. Thanks.
First, I want to thank you very much for your thoughtful remarks. I want to go back to the beginning where you were talking about the terms of leaving Brexit, or leaving the EU. You talked about negotiating as favorable terms as possible. It seems to me from the EU's perspective, they should make it difficult so other countries don't see this as a model and start leaving. I'd be interested in your comments.
Well, there's no advantage to the EU in making it easy for the UK. That's what worries me. There are voices in the EU who don't want this to be a messy and hostile divorce. This has never happened before, so nobody really knows what kind of course will be charted in the future. What we do know is that it's hugely important for the UK government pretty soon to emphasise what it sees as its red lines. You know, what are the areas that are essential to keep, and what are the areas that are flexible? For me, what's absolutely crucial is free access to the single market. We can't live in a world of tariffs. We can't live in a world of different sets of regulations. It doesn't make any sense from the view of the economy and the view of prosperity. I suspect that the process to leave will be triggered in the first half of next year. There'll then be 2 years to negotiate a deal. But we're at the point now where it's important that ideas come forward as to what that deal will look like.
Thank you. Caroline Craycraft here, please.
Minister, thank you very, very much for what I found a rather reassuring overview of this situation, which as a native-born Englishwoman, I was absolutely shattered by it. I have a slightly off the immediate. Can you tell us about the prospects for the Labour Party? I mean, this is something that really concerns me because, I mean, I'm very glad there are people like you in office, and as a Labour Party supporter, I see the total split between MPs and the on-the-ground Labour Party mind-blowing. And how can that be pulled together? Because surely that will play a major role in negotiating Brexit.
Well, at the moment, the reality is that there's no effective opposition in the UK Parliament. That's the worrying thing. Now, at the end of this month, the current leadership contest will be settled. I think what's absolutely crucial then that the party in Westminster gets its act together and starts holding the UK government to account. That's what oppositions do, and that's what they should be doing. But there's no doubt that there has been a great deal of division within the party that will take some time to repair. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but it will have to be repaired. But much of it depends on the outcome of the leadership election, and particularly the atmosphere that's created afterwards. Hugely important that we don't then see weeks and months of animosity after that.
Next question, the gentleman right here, please, at table 2.
Is there any chance that the Brexit referendum vote might be negated or reversed? For example, if a party ran squarely on the platform of ignoring and reversing the Brexit vote and got a resounding majority, wouldn't a general election trump a referendum?
I think the answer is no. I wouldn't advocate a second referendum. It will be seen by those who voted to leave as some kind of attempt by the establishment to overturn a democratic vote. The difficulty is, of course, that even if a party were to run on that platform, they're never going to achieve more than 50% of the vote. They might get a majority in Parliament, but they're going to be in early 40s maybe. It's never going to be more than 50. Well, the referendum saw a vote of 52% to leave. No political party has ever achieved a result like that since the end of the First World War. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So we have to respect the result. But the phrase I've used, the people of Wales voted to leave. I have to accept that. But what I've said is they voted to leave, but they didn't vote to be done over. So it's hugely important that the outcome, respecting their wishes, is the best outcome for Wales. But no, a second referendum isn't likely.
Okay, so on our audience has voted on what they'd like to hear about, and one of the questions is, the top question is, what are your thoughts on the recent EU ruling against Apple and its application of tax laws in Ireland?
Well, for a long time, Ireland's been very successful at attracting in major US corporations. Fine, that's good for Ireland. But this does open a Pandora's box in terms of what it means to offer what the EU calls state aid. There are rules on what you can do and what you can offer financially and in terms of benefits in kind if you're looking to attract an investor in. Now, historically, it was always believed that the tax systems were sovereign to member states because there is no EU-wide tax system in that sense. And so the tax system was seen as being outside the scope of state aid. Now, we've never had to address this because we don't have any at the moment. Well, we will in 2 years' time. We don't have any tax raising powers. But this is a major change in the way the EU operates. If it suggested that tax breaks are state aids and therefore against what the EU stands for, you could take that argument to its logical conclusion, which says that corporation tax rates should be the same across the EU, which is not what countries want to see. So I know that the Irish government is going to appeal. We'll have to wait and see what the outcome is of that appeal.
Great, next question. All right, Bill, I'm curious about something, since you mentioned Ireland both personally and professionally. Some people are talking about as the reconfiguration of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, the Republic. Do you see any opportunity for a reunited Ireland under the circumstances?
I don't. I don't. I can't see a vote like that succeeding. I mean, it depends how people vote. We know that there's a majority in Northern Ireland to remain within the UK. Even if there were to be a vote to unite Ireland, again, there are big financial consequences. The health systems are so wildly different in terms of the way they're financed. Now, that would be a major issue. At the moment, I don't think it's likely. I don't think it's likely. I mean, having Arlene Foster, who's the First Minister of Northern Ireland, she's a unionist. Clearly, she wouldn't want to see that. Martin McGuinness, Deputy First Minister, his major concern at the moment is not to see any kind of border return, because that would inflame things. I mean, that border, in the days when there were security checkpoints, they were attacked on a regular basis. And he has a personal stake in the peace process. The last thing he will want to see is extremists hijacking the reintroduction of the border as a way to start the war up again. A lot of the dynamic of that has gone. The sense of injustice, much of that has disappeared, but any sign of the border returning on both sides of the border will be unwelcome in both communities.
Yeah. Great. Next question. Yes, please, the lady right here. The mic is coming, sorry.
So I heard you say that you wanted to make sure that once the divorce is over, that you'd have still free access, right, to the EU markets, and that would not change. But what does the EU think about that? Do you think that they'll be still open to that, or would they put some restrictions?
It's far too early to tell, if I'm honest, because nobody has dealt with this situation before. Well, Greenland left the EU. And that took, Greenland left. Greenland, of course, is not a sovereign state. It's part of the sovereign state of Denmark. It's got a lot of autonomy, so it could leave. That took many years to negotiate, and basically that was just about fish, because Greenland wanted to protect its fisheries. So no one really knows what this means. No one knows what approach the European Commission will take, or at the moment what the UK will take. It's almost like as if people are dancing around each other. But over the next few months, it's going to be important, really, for both sides of the negotiation to be as open as possible in terms of where they stand. At the moment, that isn't happening. There are other oddities I haven't mentioned that have been thrown up by the vote as well. The Isle of Man, Jersey and Guernsey have an unusual status in the sense they're not part of the UK. They're self-governing territories. The only relationship they have with the UK is that the UK controls their defence and foreign affairs. They're not part of the EU either. So the Isle of Man, people of the Isle of Man, will have a passport, red passport, a UK passport, like that. And inside the passport, it says the holder of this passport is not entitled to residence in the EU because they have a different passport. Now, for them, they have a strange situation. They have a customs union with the UK, and through that, a customs union with the EU. They will now no longer have a customs union with the EU, but they can't negotiate direct with the EU because the UK government has to do it for them. So they will have to rely on the UK government to negotiate a deal for them that may not be the same deal as the deal the UK government negotiates with the UK. And so their perspective is, well, we've lost our customs union with the EU and no one asked us. That's their perspective. Jersey and Guernsey, a little bit different. They don't have that customs union. But these are all anomalies, some of them quite small, but important to those territories that will have to be sorted out.
Next question, please. Well, if we've no... Oh, there's one more? Oh, did you want to ask a question? Okay, we're going to have one of our interns ask a question. Terrific. Youth involvement.
I'm just I want to know if you have any input on equivalence regimes. I know that for service sectors, WTO members are allowed access to the single market. Yeah. For instance, if they are deemed to have regulatory systems that are up to scratch with the EU's. Mm-hmm. Do you see that as a potential means of accessing the single market for Wales?
Yes, I do. I think that's hugely important. I mean, market access is granted on a case-by-case basis. If you look at Switzerland and financial services, Switzerland has market access, but not for financial services. So it has to set up different institutions within the EU in order to access the EU's market in that regard. What I wouldn't want to see is a scenario where equivalence is negotiated on a case-by-case basis in each sector separately and individually. That would take years to do. I'd much rather see an equivalence regime being put in place that covers as many sectors as possible. You know, why would we want to have, for example, consumer goods? Why would we want to have a different set of regulations? I mean, it wouldn't make any sense. A lot of the environmental legislation is common across Europe. Most of it, actually, as far as we're concerned, it sits with the Welsh government. We're not suddenly going to dispense with all the environmental legislation because the vast majority of it is perfectly sensible. Equivalence then, yes, but I would rather see a package where there is as much equivalence as possible as part of one single package rather than having to do it on a case-by-case basis.
Gesundheit. Yes, the gentleman next to the gentleman who just sneezed.
Article 50, yet to be enacted, is my understanding. You kind of alluded to it earlier. The way I think it is starting to be seen is that governments and the European Union are starting to see what fudges can be made, because it's taking so long to enact something that should have been enacted a lot earlier than what it is. What are your thoughts on Article 50, the enactment, and then what's going to happen afterwards?
In terms of what's going to happen afterwards, that's a difficult one. Article 50 will need to be triggered, I think, in the first part of next year. I don't think it can go longer than that. There's been a referendum, and the result of that referendum has to be respected. I think the concern is, because once you start it, you've only got 2 years. And that's, bear in mind that the UK at the moment has 50 free trade agreements through the EU with other countries. Keeping those will be important. One of the main reasons why that's important is the UK doesn't have anybody to negotiate free trade agreements. No one's done it for more than 40 years. So there's literally nobody in place who can negotiate free trade agreements with any other country. It's all been done through the EU. Setting up a team of people with experience to renegotiate 50 free trade agreements is impossible. It just can't be done within 2 years. It would take decades to do it. So everybody understands that being able to secure those agreements and secure market access is hugely important. But 2 years is tough. I think originally what the UK government thought is that they would be able to have informal discussions beforehand, but the EU said, no, we're only discussing this once Article 50 is triggered. But there's no avoiding the fact that it'll have to be triggered in the first part of next year.
Yes, and one last question, please, from Rick Furfer.
Thank you. Your mention of the Channel Islands, it occurred to me that there are other territories that may be put back in play. What does all this mean for the Falkland Islands, where Argentina has its stake or thinks it has a stake, or Gibraltar, where Spain is pushing to try and reconnect with that?
Nothing for the Falklands because they're not in the EU. So their position is essentially unchanged. Gibraltar, however, is in a more difficult position. Gibraltar voted 95% to stay. And, yep, they have a border with Spain. It'll make it far more difficult for them in terms of their trade with the rest of the EU. But in the short term, there'll be no change at all. The people of Gibraltar don't want to join Spain. They made that very clear, and their views have to be respected. The same for the Falkland Islanders. They voted very heavily to remain with the status that they have now in their relationship with the UK. But yeah, I mean, the UK technically has two land borders. One's with Spain, and the other one is through Gibraltar, and the other one is with the Republic of Ireland. And the issue of how those borders will operate in the future is still very much in question. If I come back to Ireland, one of the issues that people raised was control of borders. This is a familiar refrain to all of you, control of borders. The problem is that people in GB, England, Scotland and Wales, because they don't have a border with a sovereign state, think that a border looks like something Steve McQueen tried to jump over in The Great Escape. They think it's a fence, that people can't get over. Well, that's not the way it works. The border between Northern Ireland and the Republic is, the only way you can tell you've crossed it is the line markings at the side of the road change colour. That's the first sign you see that you've crossed the border. There are many parts of that border where roads are straight, but the border snakes over the road. So you keep on, the lines change colour all the time. What happened in the days of the Troubles was the minor roads that crossed the border were cratered. They were blown up. There were designated crossing points where people had to go through security checkpoints. They're long gone. I mean, there's not even a trace of them now in the crossing at Newry, which is the one I knew very well. And there's a highway, motorway, as it's called, straight across the border now. The result is that border, it's impossible to seal it. But because people want borders they want control of the border, the next question then is, well, if you want to get into the UK, all you have to do is get into the Republic of Ireland and you're in. There is no border control between the Republic of Ireland and the UK. Now, how that will work in the future is anybody's guess. Because as I said, the Republic will maintain free movement of people and the UK won't. So you've then got a border where there's a substantially different immigration regime in place on either side of it, which has never happened before. And that's where the border becomes problematic. How do you control the flow of people over a border if you haven't got border controls in place? Once you put border controls in place, you start to reignite the problems that caused the Troubles in the first place.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the First Minister for his terrific remarks today.
Thanks, Lee.
I'd also like to mention